You've probably heard what happened to Eutychus. He fell asleep while Paul was preaching and fell from a third-story window. But if that's all we remember about this story, we've missed some of the most interesting details about that night. So let's go back to Troas. Paul had been there for 7 days. On the first day of the week, the believers gathered together to break bread. But there was something different about this particular gathering. Paul was leaving the next day. There were things he still wanted to share with them, so Paul continued speaking until midnight. And then Luke gives us a detail that would be easy to read right past. There were many lamps burning in that upper room. Now, Scripture doesn't tell us that those lamps caused Eutychus to become sleepy, but Luke does make sure we know they were there. Picture the room. Late at night, an upper chamber, many oil lamps burning, Paul still preaching. And somewhere in that room, a young man named Eutychus was struggling to stay awake. Acts doesn't tell us why Eutychus chose the window, but it does tell us exactly where he was sitting, in the window of the third story. And Eutychus wasn't simply getting a little sleepy. Luke describes him as sinking into a deep sleep and being overcome by it. Paul continued speaking. Eutychus continued fighting sleep, until eventually sleep won. He fell from the third story, and suddenly everything happening in that upper room stopped. Everyone rushed downstairs, and this is where we need to slow down, because sometimes the way this story is retold makes what happened sound uncertain, as though Eutychus fell and everyone simply thought he was dead. But that's not what Luke wrote. Acts chapter 20, verse 9 says Eutychus fell from the third loft and was taken up dead. Not unconscious, not presumed dead, taken up dead. Paul went down. He fell upon the young man and embraced him. Then Paul told the people not to trouble themselves because his life was in him. Eutychus was alive. The young man whose name carried the idea of being fortunate or lucky had just experienced something far greater than good fortune. This wasn't luck. They had witnessed a miracle. But here's where this story gets even more interesting, because this is usually where we stop telling it. Eutychus is alive. Everybody celebrates. End of story. Except it wasn't. They went back upstairs. Think about that for a moment. Back into the same upper room, past the same window, with the same people who had just rushed downstairs fearing the worst. Paul went back up. They broke bread. They ate. And Paul continued talking with them until daybreak. Yes, after everything that had happened, Paul kept going. But imagine how different that room must have felt now. Hours earlier, Eutychus was simply another young man listening to Paul. Now he was sitting among people who had watched him fall, had seen him taken up dead, and were now looking at him alive. And Luke gives us one final detail. Acts chapter 20, verse 12 says, "They brought the young man alive and were not a little comforted." In other words, they were greatly comforted. Everybody remembers Eutychus because he fell, but Scripture ends his story by telling us he was alive. And maybe that's worth sitting with. Sometimes one moment becomes the moment everybody remembers about us. A mistake, a bad decision, a moment when we simply couldn't hold on anymore. Eutychus could have forever been remembered as the young man who fell out of a window. And yes, that's part of his story, but it isn't where Scripture leaves him. The last picture we're given of Eutychus isn't his fall, it's his life. He was brought away alive, and the people who loved him were comforted. His name may have meant fortunate, lucky. But what happened in Troas that night wasn't luck. It was a miracle. And sometimes there's more to the story than the moment you fell. Acts chapter 20, verses 7 through 12. There are always details in Scripture worth slowing down for. Subscribe to Bible Stories Missed, and may you be like the Bereans. Search the Scriptures. Discover the truth.